Chapter 1. "Here we are, Sara-bear," John exclaimed, turning off the ignition before craning his neck to take in the view. His wife, Sarah, offered her own soft smile as she glanced around. "It's so beautiful here, Johnny," she breathed, her voice as soft and warm as a spring breeze, her words flavored with a gentle southern drawl that turned heads wherever they went. And oh, how many heads had turned on their journey. A tall, handsome man with broad shoulders almost never failed to turn heads. But John's gaze wasn't on the breathtaking landscape of the countryside stretching out before them, nor was it admiring his wife's youthful beauty. Instead, his eyes were locked on the strange building they had pulled up to, a motel on the side of the road, its sign crookedly advertising vacancy. Its walls were the color of fading autumn leaves, and the windows were smeared and dusty. Something about the place seemed off somehow. John shrugged off that creepy feeling, gathering their suitcases from the trunk. "Let's go check in, Sara-bear," he suggested, pressing a kiss to her forehead and taking her hand. But she had already noticed that feeling too. "Yeah, okay," she replied slowly, curiosity tinging her voice. She glanced up at him, her big brown eyes questioning, but before she could say anything else, the door to the motel office creaked open, and a woman around John's age stepped out, her arms full of boxes. "Hey there, folks," she called cheerily, heaving the boxes onto a nearby table. "You here for a room? I'm Alice," she explained as they approached. The tension in Sarah's shoulders eased at the sight of the other woman. "Yes, actually," she said, smiling. "I'm Sarah, and this is my husband, John. We're here for a little vacation." Alice grinned back, brushing a stray strand of gray hair out of her face. "Well, welcome to the motel. It's quiet around here this time of year, but I've been told the view is to die for." John nodded in agreement, but Sarah's gaze lingered on Alice. "How long have you been staying here?" she asked, her voice lilting upwards in curiosity. "Oh, just a couple of days," Alice replied, shrugging. "My car broke down nearby, and I've been waiting for a mechanic to come out here and take a look at it." Sarah's eyebrows knit together in concern. "That's terrible," she said, "but I'm glad you have a comfortable place to stay." Alice chuckled, her voice a little shaky. "Oh, I wouldn't say comfortable exactly. The rooms here are a little dated, I suppose." Sarah's husband, John, chimed in. "Well, it's better than being stranded on the side of the road, isn't it?" Alice nodded, her smile dimming a little. "Yes, I suppose you're right. At least the staff here is friendly." "Speaking of the staff," Sarah began, "where is the manager? We haven't seen anyone yet." Alice shrugged. "I haven't seen them either. They mostly keep to themselves, from what I can tell." I think the manager's office is in the back, but I haven't gone poking around too much." John chuckled. "I can understand that. We're just here for a week or so I don't think we'll need to bother them much." Sarah nodded in agreement, her eyes wandering the motel lobby once more. "So, Alice, have you heard any rumors about this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice looked around suspiciously before leaning in closer. "Well, I've heard a few things," she whispered back. "Apparently, a lot of guests have gone missing from this motel over the years. It's a real mystery, and no one can seem to figure out what's happening to them." John frowned, his protectiveness of Sara kicking in. "That doesn't sound good," he said firmly. "Let's make sure we stay together at all times, okay, Sara-bear?" Sara squeezed his hand, her heart beating a little faster at the thought of some unknown danger lurking in the shadows. "Of course, Johnny," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Alice noticed their sudden tension and gave a small dismissive laugh. "Oh, don't mind me," she said. "I'm sure it's all just rumors. This place has been around for years after all. I'm sure the manager knows what they're doing." But Sara couldn't quite shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She glanced at the dim, eerie motel lobby, with its scuffed linoleum floors and cracked, smudged front desk. A decaying leather couch sat in one corner, showing signs of wear and tear. The air was thick with a musty odor and a palpable sense of dread, as if something terrible had happened in the shadows. John, seeing her anxiety, reached for her hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Come on, Sara-bear. Let's get our room keys and get settled," he said, his voice gentle and soothing. Sara nodded, managing a small smile as she followed him into the motel office. At the counter, Sara's eyes were immediately drawn to a large, fly-ridden fish tank, filled with shimmering goldfish, its water murky and stagnant. A sinister voice came through a small speaker. "Welcome to the motel," the voice boomed, making both Sara and John jump. "I am the manager, and I will be taking care of your needs for the duration of your stay." Chapter 2. Sara stared at the grimy window, her eyes tracing the outline of the rusted air conditioning unit that hung precariously from the frame. The motel room was quiet, except for the distant hum of the traffic outside. John sat on the edge of the bed, fiddling with the radio, trying to find a station that wasn't just static. Everything felt so wrong, and I wanted to shout at the top of my lungs, "Sara, I'm over here." She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Johnny, do you hear that?" she asked, her forehead creased with concern. He hesitated for a moment before responding, his expression becoming serious. I don't know, Sara-bear," he admitted finally. It's a strange noise. It reminds me of something, but I can't quite place it." She nodded, her eyes wide and filled with worry. "Maybe it's just the wind," she suggested lightly, attempting to diffuse the tension in the air, but in the back of her mind, she knew that it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something ominous and foreboding. But Sara didn't want to worry John, who had been trying to keep their spirits up since they arrived. She bit her lip and listened carefully, straining her ears to make out the sound. John turned off the radio, the silence now deafening. All they could hear was the faint noise coming from the hallway, a soft shuffling sound, as if someone was dragging something against the worn carpet. Sara stared at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Was someone out there? She looked at John, her eyes pleading with him to make a decision. But John was as still as a statue, his eyes fixed on the door, seemingly lost in thought. "John," Sara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Johnny, what should we do?" He blinked, as if waking up from a trance, and turned to her, his expression resolute. "We're going to go out there and see what's going on," he said firmly, determination etched into every line of his face. Sarah's heart skipped a beat at his words, but she nodded, trying to appear brave. "Okay," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. John stood up, crossing the room in 2 long strides, and reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly. The door creaked as it opened, revealing the hallway outside. The corridor was dimly lit, with flickering yellow light from the overhead bulbs casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Sarah clung to John's arm as they stepped out into the hallway, her eyes scanning the surroundings nervously. The smell of mildew hung heavy in the air, and the faded wallpaper seemed to moan with the slight breeze that drifted through the dingy corridor. "John, what do you think is making that noise?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. John's brow furrowed in concentration, listening intently. "I'm not sure," he admitted, striding forward cautiously. "But it seems to be coming from the end of the hallway. Now." They continued down the corridor, pausing occasionally to listen more closely for any signs of movement. The longer they were in the motel, the more uneasy Sarah felt. She clung to John, unable to tear her gaze away from the walls, which seemed to be closing in on her. The shuffling sounds grew louder, and Sarah's heart raced as they neared the end of the hallway. They reached a door that stood slightly ajar, and John suddenly stopped, gripping Sarah's arm tightly. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. John shook his head slightly, still listening. "I don't know, Sara-bear," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "But it's getting louder." They both stared at the open door, their hearts in their throats. Without exchanging a word, John slowly pushed it open, and the noise grew even louder. They shuffled cautiously down the length of the hallway, their footsteps echoing loudly in the silent motel, until they reached the source of the noise. The door to the utility closet was slightly open, with a dim light flickering within. With a nod from John, they both leaned forward, peering into the cramped space. What they saw made their hearts race. A maid, bent over a laundry cart, her back to them. She was quietly humming to herself, unaware of their presence. Sarah let out a sigh of relief, but John's hand on her arm kept her from breathing easily. "Would a maid be here this late?" he whispered, his gaze fixed on the woman. Sarah followed John's gaze and could only stare in shock. The woman was clearly disturbed, her eyes darting nervously around the small closet. Sarah stepped closer, her hand still clutched tightly in John's. "Miss, can we help you?" The woman turned slowly, her eyes landing on Sarah. The look on her face was one of terror, and it took all her strength not to step back. But her curiosity overcame her fear, and she forced herself to speak. "We heard noises coming from this direction, and we wanted to see if everything was all right," Sarah explained bravely. The maid let out a slow, shuddering breath, her eyes still filled with fear. She looked from Sarah to John and back again, her gaze alternating between them as if trying to decide whether to trust them. Finally, she nodded and gestured towards the laundry cart in the center of the closet. "Please, don't you touch anything," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The maid nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving John. Sara couldn't help but notice the thin layer of grime that covered the woman's hands as she reached down to grab a sheet off the cart. The sight forced another shudder to ripple through her body, and she gave John's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Let's go, Sara-bear," John said gently, pulling her away from the closet. They navigated their way back to their room without speaking, the strange encounter weighing heavily on their minds. Chapter 3. Sara, John, and Alice huddled together in the dimly lit lobby, the weight of their situation heavy upon them. The stale smell of cigarette smoke permeated the air, mingling with the musty scent of damp carpet that seemed to swallow every sound within its fibers. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Sara's shallow breathing and the occasional crackle from the dust-covered intercom. Alice fidgeted nervously, her short gray hair sticking out at strange angles like an agitated cat. "This is crazy," she muttered under her breath, looking around at the dimly lit motel lobby. "We can't just stand around here all night, waiting for some invisible force to guide us out of here." John rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tension in his muscles rising. He needed to do something, to take charge of the situation, before Sara started to panic. "All right," he said, looking from Sara to Alice, his voice firmer than he felt inside. "I'm going to try exploring the motel further on my own. Sara, you and Alice should stay here in case someone else shows up. I'll be back soon." Sara looked at John, her brown eyes full of concern. "Be careful, Johnny, please." He nodded and handed Sara his phone, which was their only means of communication with the outside world. "Here, take this, and keep the door locked." John left the lobby, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Sara and Alice watched as he walked around the bend, and then they turned to look at each other. Both of them were filled with worry and uncertainty, but they tried to put on a brave face for each other. "Well, Alice, it looks like we're on our own for now," Sara said, her voice laced with determination. "Maybe we can find some clues that can help us navigate this place." Alice nodded, her eyes scanning the walls of the lobby. "You're right, Sara. We can't just sit here and do nothing." Sara's heart pounded as she and Alice peered around the corner, watching as John disappeared down the maze-like hallway. It seemed like an eternity since they'd heard his voice, but she tried not to show her worry to Alice. "Come on, Alice, we can do this together," Sara urged, sharpening her resolve. "If John's not back by morning, we have to find a way out." Alice nodded anxiously. "I'm just not sure I'm cut out for this kind of adventure, Sara. I'm nearly 60 years old. And knees aren't what they used to be," Alice said, her voice trembling slightly as she adjusted her thick glasses. Sara put a comforting hand on her companion's shoulder. "Don't worry, Alice. You're stronger than you think. And we'll stick together and help each other. That's what friends do, right?" Alice managed a weak smile, but her gaze lingered on John's disappearing form. "I wish John were here." "He always knows what to do," Sara murmured, staring down the long hallway that seemed to stretch on endlessly. "He'll be all right, dear. I'm sure of it," Alice reassured her, but Sara could hear the quaver in her voice. Together, the two women cautiously made their way down the hall, their footsteps muted by the worn carpet beneath their feet. Sara clutched her room key tightly in her hand, feeling its cold weight offer some measure of comfort. As they continued down the hallway, she stole a glance at Alice, who was walking slightly behind her. Despite the other woman's earlier bravado, it was clear that she was also on edge, her eyes flicking nervously from side to side. Sarah's heart began to beat faster and clearer at their pursuit. She had never been one for scary movies, preferring romantic comedies or light-hearted dramas instead. But now she felt like she was living in a horror film, trapped in this strange and foreboding motel. As they continued down the hallway, she noticed something peculiar. Every door they passed had a number on it, but they seemed to be in no particular order. 5D was adjacent to 2B, which was next to 16C. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, a growing sense of unease taking hold of her. This feeling was only intensified by the musty smell that seemed to permeate the air, making her feel nauseous. It was a wonder that anyone would choose to stay in this place. Sara hesitated for a moment, wondering if they should turn back or press on, but Alice seemed undeterred. "I don't think we're going to find anything by just standing around, dear," Alice finally said, breaking the silence. Sara nodded, although she wasn't entirely sure that pressing on was the right decision. She didn't want to get lost in this place, and she didn't want to be separated from John any longer than necessary. But she also knew that staying in one place wasn't going to help them. Together they moved forward, turning left at the end of the hallway. They came across a door that was slightly open, with a dim light spilling out into the hallway. Sara couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but Alice seemed to be unafraid as she pushed the door open. As they entered the room, Sara saw that it looked like a small conference room. There was a table in the center, covered in paperwork, while a single overhead light flickered overhead. We exchanged wary glances and stepped inside slowly, unsure of what to expect. As we moved deeper into the room, Sara spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know about you guys, but I have a bad feeling about this." John, always the more logical one, rejected her fears with a tight-lipped smile. "We've come this far, Sara. There's no use in turning back now." Alice chimed in with a nod, clutching her small purse tightly. "I agree, John." "We can't turn back now," Alice said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just take a look around and see what we can find." The three of them looked around the dimly lit room, their eyes slowly adjusting to the lack of natural light. Sara felt like she was in a dream, as if none of this were really happening. It was as if the walls of the motel were closing in on them, trapping them in a never-ending nightmare. Sara couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was very wrong, but she tried to push it down and focus on what they were going to do next. She took a deep breath and turned her attention to the paperwork scattered across the table in front of them. Her eyes scanned the page, searching for any clue that might lead to an escape. The documents were mostly receipts and invoices, seemingly from a range of businesses, some of which appeared to be local, while others had names that sounded eerily unfamiliar. John leaned over Sarah's shoulder to look at the papers. "I can't make much sense of these," he admitted. Alice picked up a sheet and squinted at it in the dim light. "It looks like a delivery schedule for this motel, but it's from nearly a year ago," she said, puzzled. "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "I'm not sure," John replied, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I think we need to find someone who can shed some light on this place." The three of them exchanged a worried look, realizing that they were completely lost. Chapter 4. Sarah's heart raced, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps as her mind raced with fear. She scurried down the labyrinthine hallways of the motel, the musty, worn carpet squishing beneath her feet. The fluorescent lights cast grotesque shadows on the creaking walls, giving her the impression she was trapped in some nightmarish maze. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. Yet, Sarah could feel the presence of something sinister just lurking around the corner. Her heart raced as she continued down the hallway, clinging to the cool metal of the door handles as she passed each room, praying that it wasn't the one where her and John's fate was sealed. As she reached the end of the hallway, she saw a door slightly ajar. Peering inside, she saw Alice hunched over a small table, sifting through a stack of papers. She called out softly, "Alice, are you in here?" Alice turned to face her, her eyes wide with fear. "Sarah, come in, quickly!" Sarah stepped inside and shut the door behind her. The room was dimly lit, but Sarah could make out a chest of drawers, a sagging double bed, and a small desk with a cracked mirror. The air was damp and stale, and Sarah had to resist the urge to cough. "Alice, what's going on? Where's John?" Sarah whispered urgently. Alice looked down at her trembling hands, her eyes grave. "I don't know, Sarah. We were walking down the hall, and suddenly he just disappeared." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the words that hung heavy in the air. "What do you mean disappeared? Like he left, or?" Alice shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "He just vanished. One second he was beside me, and the next he was gone." As if on cue, a faint scratching sound echoed from outside the motel room's door. Both women froze, their eyes locked on the source of the mysterious noise. Alice's grip on Sarah's arm tightened, and Sarah's heart thumped in her chest. They waited, but the sound didn't reoccur, leaving them in an unsettling silence. Sarah slowly made her way towards the door and listened intently. She strained her ears, willing herself to hear any sound over the pounding of her heart. She could barely make out a faint, shuffling noise coming from somewhere nearby. It sounded like someone was trying to be quiet but failing miserably. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She glanced back at Alice, who was wringing her hands together, her face etched with fear. Sarah knew they couldn't stay in this room forever, but the thought of opening the door and confronting whatever was out there made her stomach churn. With bated breath, Sarah turned the doorknob slowly, trying to keep it from making a sound. She winced as the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest as Alice's whispered words echoed in her mind. It's probably just maintenance. But Sara couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on her, weighing her down. With a deep breath, Sara stepped into the hall and peered down the endless rows of identical doors. She could feel the eyes of the entity on her, its malevolent presence looming in the darkness. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized that she was utterly alone. The silence in the hallway was almost deafening, and Sara couldn't hear the faint scratching noise anymore. She strained her ears, focusing on any sound that might help her determine where it came from, but her efforts were in vain. The only sound she could hear was the dull pulsating of her frantically beating heart. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. "Get a hold of yourself, Sara," she muttered under her breath. She had to think, clearly and rationally. There had to be a logical explanation for what was happening. Sara's eyes scanned the area around her, looking for any clue. Suddenly, she noticed a small mirror leaning against the wall opposite to her. She felt a sudden chill as she looked at her reflection. Her brown hair was disheveled, and her green eyes looked tired and wary. But what unsettled her the most was that her reflection looked twisted, monstrous. She let out a gasp, touching her face to confirm that it was still as it had always been. But the sight in the mirror remained the same, and her heart sank. Was this how the entity saw her? Disfigured, twisted, monstrous? Sara's mind raced as she stared at the mirror, but even more disturbing was the fact that the entity was nowhere to be seen. Had it left her alone? Or was it merely trying to lure her into a false sense of security? She trembled, but she couldn't let her fear control her. She had to stay strong, to think clearly, to find a way out of this nightmare. As she turned away from the mirror, the entity suddenly materialized out of thin air, standing directly behind her. It looked fucking disgusting, like a giant, loathsome spider with the body of a man. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow, and its voice was a low, menacing growl that sent shivers down Sara's spine. "Ah, you found me, did you, pet?" the entity sneered. "Fancy meeting you here, all alone and vulnerable." Sara's heart raced at the sight of the monster that loomed before her, but she refused to show any fear. She squared her shoulders and met its eyes with a fierce stare. "Who are you?" she demanded. The entity cackled, a chilling sound that made Sara's teeth chatter. "Oh, darling, you don't know who I am." It leaned in closer, sniffing at her like a predator sizing up its prey. "I am the embodiment of your deepest fears. The one who lingers when you least expect it," the entity said, its voice dripping with malice. "I am the one who haunts your dreams and whispers to you in the dark corners of your mind." Sara felt a shiver run down her spine as she stared into the entity's eyes. It was a sight that was both grotesque and terrifying, and she felt her legs buckle beneath her. But she fought to maintain her composure, knowing that giving into fear would only make things worse. Chapter 5. The motel's carpets swallowed their footsteps as they shuffled down the endless halls. the long-forgotten fluorescent bulbs casting sickly green light that flickered and buzzed with each step. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the echo of her abnormal heartbeat reverberating through the sterile corridors. With each passing second, her legs felt heavier, her breath shallower, and the air itself seemed to grow thinner. John squeezed her hand reassuringly, his face set in a grim, determined expression. Sarah took a deep, steadying breath as they continued down the labyrinthine halls, the smell of mildew growing stronger with each step. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with a man in a suit, standing in front of an ornate door at the end of the corridor. The manager, finally revealed. He turned to face them, his face twisted into a sinister grin. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've been waiting for you." John tensed up, his hands balling into fists at his side. "What do you want from us?" The manager chuckled, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Only what is owed to me, my dear boy. But for now," he looked over John's shoulder, his grin spreading wider as Sarah appeared from around a corner. "Let's start with her." Panic surged through Sarah's body as she saw the manager's gaze fixed on her. She stumbled back, tripping over her own feet and landing on her hands and knees. "Stay back," John barked, stepping protectively in front of her. But the manager ignored him, his focus solely on Sarah. "You, my dear, are going to help me," he said in a low, hypnotic voice. Sarah felt her heart racing and her mind spinning as she struggled to make sense of the situation. There was no time for fear, though. She knew she had to act. Mustering all her strength, Sarah lunged forward, striking the manager with as much force as she could muster. The blow connected, sending him sprawling across the floor, but he quickly regained his footing and advanced upon her. She could see the hatred in his eyes, the cruelty twisted into his features. He snarled, reaching for her, but she dodged his grasp and wheeled around, making a break for the door. She could hear the pounding of her heart in her ears, the screams of her own lungs as she sprinted down the hallways. The carpet underfoot was a blur, the walls seemed to warp around her. Was she going in circles, lost forever? Fear gave way to a burst of adrenaline as a cacophony of shouts and footsteps echoed through the labyrinthine corridors. Sarah's mind raced. She had to find John and Alice. It wasn't just her life in danger, but theirs too. But then, a turn in the hallway, and there they were, John and Alice, faces pale with fear, but unharmed. The four of them huddled together, back to back, as the manager's ominous presence lurked around every corner. "What do we do now?" Alice asked, voice trembling. Sarah squeezed her hand, steeling herself for what was to come. "We stick together. We search for a way out of this damn place as a team." John nodded, determination etched on his face. "She's right. We need to stay together," John agreed firmly. "We'll find a way out of this rat's maze." Alice looked at Sarah with a newfound respect. "You've got guts, Sarah. I never would have thought of standing up to that thing on my own." Sarah smiled wanly. "I didn't plan it, but I couldn't let it grab me. Not like it did with the others." Her voice trailed off and a heavy silence settled over the group. Sarah's mind raced with unanswered questions about what happened to the other missing guests. She shook herself out of her thoughts with a determined look on her face. "No more standing around. We need to stick together and find a way out of here," Sarah said, taking charge. John nodded in agreement, placing a protective arm around her shoulder. "Let's move." They started down the corridor, carefully checking each door. The group was shocked when Alice suddenly stopped and gasped at one of the doors. "What is it?" Sarah asked, turning to Alice. She repeated, her heartbeat quickening at the sight of Alice's pale face. "Look," Alice whispered, pointing to the door. Engraved into the wood, in elegant cursive, were the words, "Office of the Manager." Sarah felt a stirring of hope in her chest. The manager's office could hold the key to their escape from this eerie place. "We have to go in," Sarah declared, resolute. She turned the doorknob and it creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. The manager's office was just as unsettling as the rest of the motel, with the same dingy carpeting and peeling wallpaper, save for the grand mahogany desk and plush leather chair. Behind the desk, a shadowy figure sat, motionless. Sarah couldn't make out any features, but they were definitely there. John stepped forward, shielding Sarah from any potential danger. He demanded. The figure slowly rose, revealing a deep, sinister voice. "I am the manager," he said simply. His tone was calm and collected, yet there was an unsettling undertone to it. Sarah couldn't put a finger on it, but something about his demeanor made her stomach churn. "What is this place?" John asked, his grip on Sarah's waist tightening. "You'll find out soon enough," the manager replied cryptically, his eyes narrowing. The four of them stood there for a few moments, tension hanging heavy in the air. Sarah could sense John's growing unease, but she didn't want to give in to her own fear. She needed to stay strong for the both of them. With a slight nod of her head, she stepped into the room, feeling the plush carpet sink beneath her feet. The door creaked shut behind her, leaving the four of them in stifling silence. The manager took a seat behind the desk, but continued to observe them with a predatory glint in his eyes. Sarah couldn't take it any longer. "Why are we here?" she asked, hearing the shakiness in her voice and despising it. The manager leaned back in his plush leather chair and crossed his arms. "I am the intermediary between this world and the next. You see, the guests that stay here, they come willingly or unwillingly, but they all share one common characteristic." He paused, watching them intently. "All are seeking redemption." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. That doesn't make any sense. Why would the motel hold people against their will? What kind of redemption were they seeking? Sarah's mind raced as she struggled to make sense of the manager's cryptic words. The manager continued, oblivious to the questions spinning in Sarah's mind. "Every guest that stays here has done something terrible in their lives, something that has haunted them to this day. They are brought here by the entity, who presents them with various trials and tribulations that they must overcome in order to find peace. Some guests, however, never leave the motel, doomed to relive their traumas and mistakes for all eternity. Sarah's brows furrowed in confusion. But what does that have to do with us? We're just on vacation, trying to spend some time together before I start my new job. John looked between the manager and Sarah, his grip on her waist tightening anxiously. That's right. We don't belong here. You have to let us go. A cruel smile twisted the manager's lips. Chapter 6. The manager's laughter, dark and menacing, filled the cramped office. Sarah, John, and Alice clung to each other, hearts pounding in sync with the soft hum of the ancient air conditioner. The rough wool of the chairs bit into their skin, grounding them in the nightmare unfolding. Sarah's eyes, wide with terror, remained fixed on the manager's unseen form. This can't be happening, she whispered, gripping John's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. Before John could respond, the manager's voice echoed through the room, deep and commanding. Ah, but it is, my dear. Your journey has commenced. The shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Journey? What are you talking about? The manager chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. Your trials, my dear. This motel, these halls, they're alive. They feed on your fear, as I do. Alice gasped, her fingers digging into Sarah's arm. That's impossible, is it? The manager's voice dripped with mockery. You must be new to town. Let me fill you in on a little secret. This motel is cursed. It was built on an ancient burial ground, and that curse has been passed down through generations. Each visitor that sets foot in this wretched place becomes trapped within its dimly lit, grimy halls, to live out the remainder of their days as the manager's unwilling playthings. Sarah's heart raced as John's grip on her hand grew even tighter. But why are we here? She cried, desperation lacing her voice. That's a very good question, the manager answered, and I'll let you in on a little secret. I don't know. You see, the victims who wind up here, I never choose them. They simply show up. And as for why you're here, well, that's something even I can't answer. But don't worry, the entity will be here shortly to explain everything. With each word, Sarah felt a crushing weight settle upon her heart, making it harder and harder to breathe. She clung to John, her fingers intertwined with his, as they listened to the manager's chilling story. The idea that they were completely at the mercy of some malevolent force was almost too much to bear. It's all right, Sarah, John whispered, but his own fear was palpable. They turned to each other, eyes meeting in the dim light, the reality of their situation settling in. The manager's sinister laugh filled the small office once again. Yes, I am the mastermind behind it all. The motel, the entity, I control everything. I feed off the fear of my victims. The more they fear, the stronger I become. Sarah's eyes widened as the manager's revelation sunk in. She looked at John and Alice, their faces reflecting her shock and horror. How long have we been here? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Longer than you can imagine, the manager replied, his voice cold and calculated. Some victims remain trapped here for days, weeks, even months. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to grasp the enormity of the situation. But why? Why are you doing this? The manager leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. You see, fear is a powerful emotion. It's the most primal of human instincts, and when fed, it can be used to manipulate and control. That's what I do here. I feed on your fear. Sara shuddered, feeling a wave of unease wash over her. The manager seemed so certain of his purpose, so confident in his twisted methods. She couldn't fathom how anyone could find enjoyment in such a cruel and unusual punishment. "But what about us?" Alice asked, her voice trembling as she spoke up. The manager leaned back in his chair, a sly smile spreading across his face. "Ah, my dear, you all are just the latest in a long line of guests here at my motel. You see, I have a unique way of helping my visitors deal with their fears and demons," the manager continued with a wicked grin. "Now that you fully understand the nature of this establishment, I would like to offer you all a choice." Alice, sensing the gravity of the situation, spoke up meekly. "What kind of choice?" The manager chuckled, pulling a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket and offering it to Sara. "You see, I've prepared a little test for each of you. Once you complete it, I guarantee you will be free to leave this accursed place. However, if you do not pass, I'm afraid there may be consequences." The manager leaned back in his chair, watching Sara and the others carefully. Sara's thoughts raced, her mind buzzing with possibilities. They were trapped in a nightmare, and in the twisted mind of this sadistic man, completing a test was their ticket to freedom. She looked at John and Alice, their eyes wide with terror. Sara felt a surge of anger replace her fear. She snatched the piece of paper from the manager's hand. "We'll do whatever it takes to escape this cursed place." The paper was old and worn out, with 3 questions scrawled in an unfamiliar handwriting. Sara read the first one aloud. "What scares you the most?" She pondered the question for a moment, struggling to think of something that didn't seem mundane or absurd in the grand scheme of events. Finally, she answered, "Losing the people I love." The manager nodded, seemingly pleased with her honesty. A common fear indeed. And the second question, "What are you most thankful for?" Sara didn't hesitate for a moment this time. "The love and support of my husband, John." Again, the manager nodded. "A cherished gift. And for the final question, what is one thing you wish you could change about yourself?" The question caught Sara off guard. It was difficult to think of anything she'd do differently about herself in this traumatic situation. But the manager insisted. After a moment, Sara answered, "I wish I could stop worrying so much. If I wasn't so anxious, maybe this wouldn't have happened to us." The manager chuckled at her response. Interesting sentiment. Now, on to the test itself. On a scale of 1 to 10, how scared are you of losing the people you love? Sara hesitated for a moment, gripping the paper tightly. The enormity of the test hung heavy in the air, washing over her like a wave of cold water. She looked up at the manager, the words "on a scale of 1 to 10" echoing in her mind. The manager leaned forward, his gaze piercing through her. "Well, how scared are you?" Sara took a deep breath and spoke the words aloud. 10. The manager's lips curved in a sinister smile, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Chapter 7. Sara's eyes, wide with a mix of fear and determination, scanned the labyrinthine hallways, her petite frame trembling ever so slightly. Her thoughts raced with questions and uncertainty, but one thing remained clear. She would not give in to this nightmare. Beside her, John's tall, stoic silhouette cast an imposing shadow, shielding her from the grotesque shadows that danced on the wall. He spoke in a low voice, full of resolve. We have to keep moving, Sara. I don't know what's waiting for us, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." Sara nodded, gripping her husband's hand tighter as they made their way down the dimly lit hallway. Every step they took echoed in the eerie silence, and her heart threatened to beat out of her chest with each passing second. As they turned the corner, they saw a light flicker at the end of the corridor, casting elongated shadows on the walls. Sara's stomach churned in sick anticipation as they approached the door. John's grip on her hand tightened. They could hear the faint cries and moans coming from the distant room, and Sara's heart raced as the reality of the situation began to set in. As they pushed open the heavy wooden door, the smell hit them like a wall, a mixture of sweat, smoke, and God knows what else. The room was small and cluttered, with discarded furniture and pieces of clothing strewn about carelessly. The flickering light was coming from a single lamp in the corner, casting an eerie glow on the grimy walls and the gruesome scene we found ourselves in. People of all ages were huddled together on the floor, skinny and dirty, with sunken eyes that seemed to be telling a tale of their own. Their expressions were filled with fear and desperation, yet at the same time, a strange sense of acceptance. It was as if they had given up all hope of ever leaving this place alive. As Sara took in the scene before her, John suddenly let out a gasp. In the center of the room, chained to a filthy, rusted bed, lay Alice, a vacant look in her eyes. John rushed towards her, not caring about the horrors surrounding them, only focused on his wife and their fellow traveler. "Alice," he cried, tears streaming down his face. "We have to get you out of here." But it was too late. Alice's body lay limp, her life snuffed out like a candle. Sara's breath hitched in her throat as she saw Alice's sightless eyes. The despair in John's face was almost too much to bear, and Sara squeezed his hand, urging him to look at her. She whispered, "We have to keep going, John. We have to find a way out of here." John nodded absently, still staring at Alice. With a jolt, he got to his feet and turned away. Together, they walked back through the dim hallway, back to the manager's door. The manager's menacing laughter came through the walls as they neared the office. "Are you ready?" he called out. John, with gritted teeth, appreciated the chilling sensation that ran down his spine. "Yes," he answered morosely. The door opened, revealing the same dingy room they had left mere moments ago. The manager sat at his desk, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Welcome back. How was the little journey? I trust you took the test seriously." His voice echoed through the motel's dim lobby, and Sara clenched her fists in anger. "We won't play your games anymore. We just want to leave." The manager's smile only broadened. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, my dear. You see, you and John are still bound by the entity's grasp. You won't be able to leave until you complete the tasks I've set for you." The manager leaned back in his chair, his grin still in place, knowing he had the upper hand. Sara's chest tightened and her breathing hitched. "What tasks?" she demanded, trying to control the rising panic in her voice. "All in due time, my dear. For now, let's focus on getting you two situated in your room for the night." He uncrossed his arms and steepled his fingers together on the desk. "Ah, yes, the tasks. You see, each one is designed to help you confront your deepest fears and confront them head-on. I promise you, by the end of it all, you'll have faced the darkness you thought had consumed you. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to your assignments. Sara, you have 3 tasks before you, the first being the most important. You must confront and vanquish the thing that scares you the most, losing the people you love. John, despite the fear gnawing at him, found determination. He swore to himself that no matter what they faced in this accursed place, he would not let the darkness claim his wife. Their first task pushed them deeper into the bowels of the motel, where the darkness lay thick and oppressive. They stumbled through narrow corridors lined with shuttered doors, the only light coming from the flickering flame of a candle held by Sara. Each turn brought new terrors. Distorted voices whispered from the shadows, dripping with malevolence and remorse. They beckoned, They beckoned, taunting, and Sarah's heart sped up as they neared the room assigned to Sara. John stepped in front of her, insistent. "Let me go in first." Sara hesitantly nodded, and he pushed open the door, casting light on the room inside. The sight that greeted them stole their breaths. A mirror hung on the wall, and it reflected not Sara and John, but the broken souls they had witnessed earlier, warped and twisted into grotesque monsters. They were shivering and hunchbacked, their eyes full of madness, clawing at the walls and floors as if trying to escape their own damned existence. Sara's heart felt heavy, bearing witness to the suffering of these lost souls. "Stay close to me," John whispered, gripping her hand as they stepped inside the room, the candle held firmly in his other hand. As they ventured closer, an electric chill ran down Sara's spine. The creatures in the mirror snarled at their every movement, their mouths distorted into twisted rictuses. Sara held her breath as she tightly grasped John's hand, planting one shaky step after another. They moved cautiously, unsure of what to expect next. "You have to tell me what the other tasks are, manager," Sara yelled defiantly, her voice echoing off the walls. "This one isn't enough." The manager cackled from somewhere in the shadows. "Oh, my dear, I can't have you rushing things. As you have just experienced, each test is meant to challenge you to confront your own personal fears. Only then can you truly break free from what's been holding you prisoner," the manager explained cryptically. "But Alice is already gone," Sara protested. "What good can possibly come from making us face this again?" "But you don't understand the rules of the game just yet. You see, there are far worse fates than death awaiting you in this place, including the very real possibility of never escaping your own personal hell." The manager's voice seemed to slither through the dimly lit space, sending a shiver down their spines. "Your heartbreak is the key to your freedom, Sara. You must face the trauma of losing Alice and accept the fear that comes with it, or you will remain trapped here forever. Now, close your eyes and let me guide you." Sara clenched her jaw, tears streaming down her face, and did as the manager commanded. Her eyes squeezed shut against the visions that immediately assaulted her. She saw herself standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping around her, trying desperately to hold on to a small child who clung tightly to her hand. Her eyes were wide with fear as she tried to pull the child towards her, but it was too late. The child's grip faltered, and she felt herself being dragged inexorably over the edge. She tried to grab onto anything she could as she plummeted towards the earth below, but all she could feel was the emptiness around her, enveloping her like a shroud. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, she felt herself tumbling through an endless abyss, a black void that swallowed all light and sound. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum as she fell, her body growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, she landed with a thud, the impact shaking her to her core. Cold darkness surrounded her, a suffocating embrace that threatened to suffocate her. With a silent cry, She reached out blindly, feeling something cold and hard in her hands. She pulled it towards her, and faint traces of light began to appear. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a simple, worn wooden box, its surface covered in layers of dust and grime. With trembling hands, Sara lifted the lid of the box. A blinding light burst forth, illuminating the entire space. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, replaced by several tiny glass orbs. They floated in the air around her, glowing softly with an ethereal, otherworldly light. Sara reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against one of the orbs. It pulsed gently at her touch, its light intensifying briefly before returning to its soft glow. She picked it up, feeling a warmth spread through her hand, up her arm, and into her chest. A sense of peace washed over her, and she knew, somehow, that this orb contained a piece of Alice. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the remaining orbs, understanding their significance. Each one held a fragment of the lost souls they'd encountered, including Alice. The manager's voice echoed in her mind. "Your heartbreak is the key to your freedom, Sara. Accept the fear, and you'll break the entity's grasp." Determination surged within her. She wouldn't let Alice or any of those poor souls remain trapped in this hellish place. She gathered the orbs, their combined light filling the room with a warm, comforting glow. Back in the hallway, Sara, John, and Alice stood tall, their fear replaced by resolve. The entity's influence waned, the endless loops and twists of the motel beginning to straighten. They walked, hand in hand, towards the lobby. In the final moments of their ordeal, Sara, John, and Alice, now reunited, gathered their courage, each clutching an orb containing fragments of lost souls, including Alice's. As they stepped into the lobby, the warm light from the orbs illuminated the shadows, revealing the grimy motel as it truly was, fading, cracking, and peeling back, layer by layer. The manager watched them, his predatory gaze flickering as the orbs glowed ever brighter. He reached forward, his grip weakening under the light's power, his figure flickering like a mirage. With a final burst of courage, Sara held the orbs aloft, the light spilling over the lobby, dissolving the cursed walls into dust. As the hotel crumbled around them, the three found themselves outside, bathed in the clear morning sunlight. Sara clutched John's hand, a weight lifting from their shoulders as they breathed in the fresh, untainted air. The nightmare was over, and the cursed motel had finally released its captives. With the dawn's first rays, they turned away from the ruins of the motel, leaving behind the twisted remains of the past and stepping forward together, free from the darkness that had haunted them. If you like this story, and for more dark stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See ya!